Sigh. Nothing's ever easy anymore.
No worries. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome today, everybody, to Ring of Fire Con. I am actually honored today to be here with an actual real-life rocket scientist as well as amazing science fiction author, Edward M. Lerner. Mr. Lerner, thank you for coming in and having a conversation with us.
My pleasure.
Excellent, excellent. So, I mean, you have, a very interesting background, sir, if I may say, because did you want to write science fiction originally? Because originally your skills in engineering actually were in some of the biggest aerospace areas that I can think of. But then tell me a little bit about that and how that actually propelled you into science fiction.
Okay, well, certainly I have been a fan since roughly forever.
Excellent.
I didn't have aspirations to be an author probably until college. At that point, I sent one or two submissions off to a magazine, took rejection very much to heart and didn't think about it again for quite a few years.
Okay.
In 1982, I finished getting an MBA at night. And for the first time in years, I had time for recreational reading. Apparently, I complained too much about what I was reading, and my wife said something on the order of, "So I suppose you can do better," which obligated me to try.
Funny.
I finished my first novel a few years later. It being a first novel, it then took me another few years to sell. When I did finally sell it, I had just started work at Hughes Aircraft.
Excellent.
And that was a wonderful place to be a science fiction author, except for the fact that I was working 7 days a week and had no time to write anymore.
Oh my.
Yeah. But I accumulated all sorts of good background, and after I left Hughes and wrote my second novel, I decided it was time to take this seriously. One sale is a fluke, 2 sales is a pattern. So in 2004, shortly after I'd left Hughes Aircraft, I decided to take this seriously. I quit the day job, and I've been writing full-time ever since.
Excellent. Now, I mean, I'll have to ask. Actually, I have 2 questions to ask. 1 comment. First, behind every great man is an amazed wife. That's my only comment there. It certainly is. It's certainly true in my marriage. But I will also say this, that it's interesting that you said, well, that your beginning as a writer began with essentially not only a rejection, but that, I could do better. Because it's surprising to me how many amazing authors come out of, essentially the look of they read a book that's frankly terrible. And in reading a book that's frankly, please.
There are plenty of terrible books out there. Of course,
yes.
I'm sure there are people who aren't in love with everything I've written, and different strokes for different folks.
Oh, I agree. But it's always so interesting to see authors essentially emerging from that, because, I have actually taught classes where I've said, like, every author comes from a bad book. It's like, well, this is horrible. I can do better than that. And you said your first rejection was in college, so you had quite a span there. How did that go about, and what was the? I mean, everyone gets rejected, but that time span, do you think it allowed you to grow?
Well, I seem to have misled you a little bit. So I uh, probably got those rejection letters around 1970. I didn't
Hmm.
even attempt to write fiction again for at least 10 years.
Okay.
So it wasn't that I grew in the interval. I merely got over the trauma.
Ah, okay. Well, I mean, that's quite a, I mean, but that's quite a leap. And I think that your time at places like, Bell, Hughes Aircraft, Northrop Grumman, and so on, do you think it kind of allowed you to build a, a knowledge base that your science fiction comes from?
Oh, absolutely. Um, Bell Labs and Honeywell were wonderful places to learn about practical applications of computers. I mean, yes, I have a computer background from college as well, but real world applications are handy to know. Then 7 years at Hughes Aircraft as a NASA contractor, occasionally meeting actual rocket scientists and astronauts. Yeah, of course, that made a big difference.
Excellent. And
So, yeah, by the time I decided to do this full time, I had a lot of arrows in my quiver.
well, yeah, because I mean, I see like from books like Energized, which deals with alternate energy, and Small Miracles, which is like nanotech, and and all of these, your your science fiction has in many ways a basis in very hard science. Um, would you say that that is an appeal to your science fiction? Because there are plenty of people who who say, how does my FTL work? Or, when somebody asks them how their FTL works and they go, well, it's powered by plot. Um, you're not one of those.
Typically not.
No,
Yes, I like to believe that I take the science seriously, that the name of the genre is science fiction with equal weight on both words.
excellent.
When I don't have the necessary science background myself, I certainly reach out to specialists. So you mentioned Small Miracles, which is a book dealing with medical nanotech. The
Hmm.
nanotech side, I had a reasonable grasp of going in. The medical side, not so much. So I cornered a fair number of specialists in biology, neurology, biophysics to pick their
Oh, wow.
brain. And when one of the biophysicists, uh, after the third or fourth round of questions, said, Ed, it's fiction, it's okay, I figured I had delved deeply enough.
That is awesome. I mean, what is it like to talk to all those people? I mean, because like you said, your background is not uh, in the medical side of things, but these are, I assume, people who are on the forefront of some of the technologies that are going to be shaping mankind. And I mean, you are a technologist at your core. Am I
Yeah,
wrong in that?
I think of myself as a technologist. And when I make a cold call or cold email to scientists, I always explain my background and that it's important to me to use science properly.
Hmm.
That I think helps the hit rate at which people agree to cooperate. You know, I take no offense when some university specialist does not have time or does not have interest. It's not their job to feed data to science fiction authors. But an awful lot
Fair enough.
of scientists are science fiction readers and are delighted to help. And that's fun.
That's
And
awesome.
uh, I more often than not find that the kinds of questions I'm asking about speculative extrapolations of what people are doing turn out to
Hmm.
be very interesting to these people too. You mentioned my novel Energized, which deals with solar power satellites
Yes.
and secondarily with radio astronomy.
Hmm.
When I visited the Green Bank Radio Observatory in West Virginia, which is just an awesome, awesome place. I got invited. Yeah, I got invited to the weekly staff lunch of the astronomers and the engineers. I was asked to say a few words about why I was there, which of course I did. And all these, world-class scientists and engineers then spent their lunch hour brainstorming nuances of my plot for me. It was awesome.
Oh, I could only imagine that I would have been there like, ignore me, just take notes. That's amazing. I mean, having that kind of at your disposal, that kind of scientific knowledge, especially on things like this. Now, I will ask a question. You also work very heavily within. You've worked with Larry Niven before, and his is an interesting kind of science fiction because it's both highly scientific, but it also has all the tropes of what we would call science fantasy. Correct?
I agree. And when I hesitated a bit when you said I always am scientifically rigorous, it was the collaborations with Larry that made me hesitate. So he and I did 5 books together, which are set in his known space future history.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all set several hundred years in the future where some technologies like FTL are common.
Yes.
Because what we worked on together had to fit within the frame of his known space. I couldn't avoid just accepting as givens some of the hand-wavium technology.
Well, yes,
What I like to think I brought to the partnership was, first of all, I added a lot of computer science into his universe. Mm-hmm. Larry doesn't have that background. And so there is remarkably little of any kind of computer science or artificial intelligence, even several hundred years into the future, and no explanation of why that is. Also, one of his spiffy technologies, you may remember, is something called the General Products Hull.
Yes.
It was a spacecraft technology that was basically indestructible, and there was a very minor description in some of his earlier works of how those hulls were constructed. The only thing that would destroy it was basically antimatter in sufficient quantities. Well, I took great delight in the Fleet of Worlds series of novels of coming up with several different technologies consistent with what he had written by which General Products hulls could be destroyed.
Very nice. How did Larry handle that, out of curiosity?
I think he enjoyed it.
Very good. Well, I mean, and it's interesting you say that, because one of the things that we have seen, especially with harder science fiction, and I don't use the word when I am selling books or describing books. I actually don't use the words hard science fiction. I use the word crunchy science fiction. It's crunchy. Because, to the general public, hard science fiction, what does that mean? You say it's crunchy, it's crunchy. You have to actually kind of, chew on this a bit. We've seen certain aspects of crunchy science fiction, for instance, particularly in computer technology. There is a famous cyberpunk novel that was like, I jammed into my brain, 30 megabytes of data. And at the time you're like, 30 megabytes of data, that's massive. And now it's like, so he plugged in his iPod? How do we actually address, or how do you address actually, the march of technology? And sometimes technology moves a little faster or a little slower than we expect it to. How do you address that in your writing?
Okay, that is a challenge. And before I answer that, I will agree with you that hard science fiction is a terrible name that is too often conflated with difficult to read science fiction, which is not what authors go for.
Yes.
Okay, how do I deal with the march of technology? I struggle with it like every author does. You know, we all read different science websites, journals to try to keep up. We try to extrapolate. Sometimes we're overly optimistic about how quickly things will change. Sometimes we're remarkably pessimistic about how fast things turn out to change.
Fair enough.
A lot of what I write is near future. And the interesting thing about writing near future science fiction or techno thrillers is if you're really unlucky, your book is obsolete before you finish it.
That's interesting.
When that happens, then we go to an axiom of one of the grandmasters, although I forget which one, who said that sooner or later all science fiction becomes alternate history.
Interesting. That's an interesting point because we have seen that. I mean, frankly, I'm still waiting for my moon base. And I think I have a little while longer to go. But we look at things that have become essentially atomic rockets or space punk or wherever we want to put it, and it is history. I don't know about you. I don't actually live in a ghoulie household, but we look at ideas of what 2020 looked at or looked like from the 1950s, and obviously it was quite something. I would say this. Another question is that you had mentioned FTL Technology. You actually wrote a nonfiction piece on FTL that was absolutely fascinating in regards to, what are the implications of FTL, if it's possible or not, and so on. Where did that come from, and where did you, develop that, that premise essentially in terms of looking at a realistic take on FTL technology?
Okay, I did a series of articles for Analog that collectively we call the science behind the fiction. And naturally in that category, one of the articles pretty much had to be dealing with FTL. Anyone who's studied physics in the last century or so has been exposed to Einstein's theory of relativity, and that gets into a lot of interesting wrinkles. The thing about general relativity is it's a set of very messy equations that can hardly ever be solved exactly. They can only be solved in special cases. And so that led to a very long, slow process of rolling out all of the implications. Even though the very earliest solutions and even the premise of special relativity that came first said nothing can travel faster than light in a vacuum, these special cases popped out. Things like the possibility that wormholes could exist. A wormhole, very briefly, is a connection between a black hole and a never before seen but theoretically possible white hole, which is, as you would expect, the opposite of a black hole. Stuff comes spewing out of it instead of falling into it. And you pair those things together, a black hole and a white hole, you get a tunnel through space that follows a path that's perhaps different and shorter than how we would normally get there. So if you can take a shortcut, then you can effectively go faster than light. The analogy is, where the name wormhole comes from, is think of a worm wanting to get around an apple. If he goes through, maybe he can get there faster than crawling around. Well, the same way there are solutions of general relativity involved in a neighborhood where there is lots and lots of mass, where space-time is drastically curved. And if the curved spots associated with the black hole punches through and connects up with the curved spot associated with the white hole, you can get one of these shortcuts. And like any shortcut, it's faster than going the long way, and you can effectively go faster than light.
Interesting.
Yeah. It turns out.
And what? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Speaking of the series of articles that dealt with all sorts of stuff, time travel, suspended animation, medical challenges in space flight, some computer aspects. I collected all 16 or so of these articles and updated them into a collection called Troping the Light Fantastic, the science behind the fiction.
Excellent.
Only those of us old enough to recognize the Cole Porter song smile at that title. Everyone else scratches their heads.
I like the title. And you know, looking at other tropes, I mean, we look at things like, I mean, we're beginning to start in theoretical technologies emerging, like the work of Miguel Albuquerque in terms of FTL drives and whatnot. And, you know, it's almost like as if we're on a cusp of something. Do you feel that humanity, in terms of its development of technology, will overcome, you know, essentially its own shortcomings, both societal and you know, biological and technological?
I like to be optimistic, although in 2020 that's hard.
Fair enough.
Yes, the Albuquerque drive is another interesting possibility for FTL. Thank you for reminding me of that. In fact, that underpins a story I have running right now in the Grantville Gazette.
Yes.
Briefly, the technology there, it's another solution of the equations of general relativity, is if you can distort space properly, you can change its properties. And theoretically, in properly distorted space, the speed of light could be different. Now, in order to distort space in this manner, you need to have negative energy. And no one knows what negative energy might really be, but it's theoretically possible. And if we can come up with that, then you can warp space around your spaceship. And even though you never exceed the speed of light in your warp bubble, you keep pushing this warp bubble ahead of you and carry it with you. And so you're traveling faster than light outside the bubble, but inside your bubble, you're still obeying relativity.
Interesting. And, you know, when those equations came out, I like you, I am a bit of a technologist, and you know, I found it fascinating until I was like, wait, we need enough exotic matter to the size of the solar system when we can only make a teaspoon of it. But like you said, optimism. These are things that, you know, future current theories become future technologies. You know, what do you see the direction of some of the technologies, and how does that affect your writing?
Okay. One of the joys of being a science fiction author is that anything that is not prohibited can be considered inevitable. You just have to push it far enough out. Okay, as to particular technologies that ought to be coming sooner than inevitably sometime, I would expect atomic rockets. Yeah, that technology was actually researched and thought about very early on in the atomic age, but people tend to get hysterical about anything to do with radiation, and so the work was pretty quickly cut off. Now, the simplest form of atomic rocket is you just throw a bunch of small nukes out the back of your ship and let it push against a big pusher plate. And that's a technology called Project Orion, and Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell used that famously in one of their books.
Yes.
I think it was Footfall.
I believe it was, but it escapes me at this moment too.
Yeah. But a much cleaner sort of nuclear-powered spaceship, and one that's clearly within reach, is you just use a small nuclear reactor to heat up a reactant, a propellant, to higher speeds than any chemical process can do. So if you get something really hot, boiling and shooting out the back faster than you can get with a chemical reaction, you get
thrust.
You get more thrust than you can from any chemical rocket.
Interesting.
At such time as fusion turns out to be practical, you can use a fusion reaction to get really high speed reactions. And that is fairly likely. A lot of science fiction set a century or two out uses a technology called the Buzzard ramjet. And Buzzard was a real world physicist who came up with this idea. And the theory is that you scoop up the little bit of hydrogen that's in interstellar space and you funnel it into a fusion reactor and then shoot it out the back. There is insufficient data to know whether a fusion reaction, whether there's enough fuel out there to drive that practically, whether the scoop that you need, which is an enormous magnetic field, will generate too much drag for that to be a practical solution. But if nothing else, it turns out that that big magnetic field can be a wonderful braking mechanism if you do get yourself at high speed to slow down at the other end. Another technology that is being developed right now involves basically laser boosters. Science fiction for ages has dealt with the concept of solar sailing, where you put up a big, thin surface sail. Think of it as a really thin sheet of plastic, probably miles across, and let sunlight push it. The problem is you accelerate very slowly. If you have a stronger source of light, you can accelerate faster. And so there was something called the Breakthrough Initiative that a Russian billionaire is funding.
Really?
Yes. And the idea is to develop a lot of space-based lasers that could very rapidly accelerate little probes that have sails attached, because the lasers are putting out much more intense light
than the solar wind.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so this Breakthrough Initiative is hoping to be able to send probes to nearby stars within the next century.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that existed. That's spectacular. And we're seeing, we expected, space technology to be, well ahead of what it was if you look at, the 1960s and 70s. But we're now beginning to see things like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and all of these various space entrepreneurial companies. What do you expect? Where do you expect that to go? And how can that actually be also placed within a fiction setting?
Well, space tourism certainly looks like it's coming. A few billionaires have already bought their way out there. And with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Horizon, it'll probably come down to the point where mere 100 millionaires can afford it. I'm still collecting small change for my sofa cushion, but I don't see that happening.
Anytime soon. Yeah, for me neither. Yeah, trust me.
But I suspect that within the next 10, 20 years, we will see space-based hotels,
Hmm.
which was another feature of my novel Energized.
Yes.
Um, the more exciting application of privatized space travel that I hope to see is mining in space. And actually, a lot of my novels have
Involved.
had the premise of asteroid mining.
Hmm.
This being a Ring of Fire conference, I will mention that my first book from Ring of Fire Press, The Company Man, deals with space mining, and the eponymous character is an accountant working for a space mining company, an asteroid mining company, who finds himself dragged willy-nilly into layer upon layer upon layer of deceit.
Oh my.
Yes. So
And
there's my plug for Eric.
there you go. Now, and so one of the things that we have about enough time for about two more questions. So, what are you working on now that we can expect to see in the future?
Okay, two things. I have a new novel in the production process now that should come out in May called Deja Doomed. It's about early colonization of the moon, and some Americans and Russians separately happen upon artifacts left over by an ancient visit by aliens and technology they don't fully understand.
Oh my.
Okay, and Doomed will give you a clue that all is not well. That's the nature of novels, all is not well.
Usually.
Yeah. And secondly, I'm working on a story arc loosely called The Shoals of Spacetime, which is the name of the first story in the arc, currently running in the Granville Gazette in the Universe Annex section. Has nothing to do with the 1632 stories. As I say, the first story is running now, and it deals with basically a cruise ship of aliens that has a terrible accident in interstellar space, and the survivors limp to our solar system and have to decide, do they make contact? How do they make contact? What can they tell us about themselves? And what unfolds thereafter? That's the first story in an arc. The second story, I believe, is scheduled for November, and I'm working on the completion of the arc.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. And then finally, where can we find your books going forward? I want everybody here to be able to, to find your books, and where can they find them? And do you have a website? Do you have contact information for guests to ask you additional questions that I might not have covered?
Okay. I'm, of course, delighted to answer all of that. And naturally, everything is available through Amazon.
Excellent.
My website is cleverly named edwardmlerner.com. As long as you spell Lerner properly, you're okay. It's Lerner. And there's an email address there to contact me.
Excellent.
I have a Facebook presence as edwardmlerner.com.
Excellent.
And there regularly. So
Excellent.
it's easy to find me.
All right. And sir, thank you for this. I greatly appreciate you coming on out to Ring of Fire Con and taking your time out of, a busy day building essentially the forward future of mankind as fiction. I greatly appreciate you taking your time out to talk to the guests of Ring of Fire Con and myself and so on. This has been a huge thrill. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who is here listening to this, and we greatly appreciate you attending.
And thanks for the invitation. I had fun.
All right. Thank you, guys. You have a good day now, and we'll catch up with you shortly. And everybody, you know, Edward M. Lerner is one of the best science fiction authors out there. You should definitely pick up his stuff. And his nonfiction is just as good. Thank you.
Thanks.